Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Remarkably, given that they are currently governed by a man who represents just about all that is rotten in the state of Western democracy, you need to turn to the American media at the moment for a full idea of what is happening here and indeed how we look to the rest of the world. That magnificent call from Bill in Exeter last week, a brave and honourable man with the ability and the intelligence to recognise the scale of his own error in that Brexit referendum, was written about at some length in the New Yorker magazine. And it is in the New York Review of Books that you will find the most exhaustive account of why Britain needs its own Mueller investigation into the alleged shenanigans undertaken by the likes of Arron Banks, this gentleman Andy Wigmore, and your friend and mine, Nigel Farage. The article in the New York Review of Books is written by Carole Cadwalladr, and she joins me on the line now. I should introduce you properly, Carole, if you give me a moment. She is, of course, the winner of the British Journalism Awards Technology Journalism Award in December 2017. She, in June of this year, won the Orwell Prize for Political Journalism, specifically for her work on the impact of big data on the EU referendum and the 2016 US presidential election. And most recently, indeed this very month, the Reporters Without Borders L'Esprit de RSF Award for her work on the subversion of the democratic processes. So a journalist of extremely high repute, and yet I gather this weekend you tried to appear on LBC and someone hung up on you.
Yes, again. Somebody really doesn't want to answer my questions or even hear them, which is, I find, kind of phenomenal.
But surely not the straight-talking guy who's got an answer for every question and always says what he thinks, Nigel Farage. It must have been someone else. Was it?
It was the great advocate of free speech, actually, Nigel Farage, who didn't want to hear my questions or put me on air, which I find contradictory, I have to say, James.
In his defence, could it just be that he wants to have a lawyer present before he talks to you?
That's an interesting point. What I do know is that he knows that I've been asking these questions over a sustained period of time. I've been seeking to interview him. His press spokesman won't even respond to my messages, but he has done a spoiler interview with another publication, with the Sunday Times, in fact, and that's what we always see with both Nigel Farage and with Arron Banks. They always do this thing of sort of trying to pick a publication that they see as being more friendly towards them, which doesn't always work. But I really don't get it. These are really, really straightforward questions that I have. They're very simple.
Can you run us through them? Can you run us through a few of them?
Well, I really want to ask Nigel Farage. He's always talking about British sovereignty and the importance of that and our laws and our institutions. But he will not go anywhere near the question of the funding of his campaign. That's just one question. So we know that Arron Banks now, the Bristol businessman, he got referred just about 10 days ago to the National Crime Agency. National Crime Agency only deal with serious and organised crime. And then allegations of serious and organised crime. That's correct, yes. And they're now looking, because the Electoral Commission has said, after a year-long investigation, that they are not clear where Arron Banks' money came from, and they cannot be certain that it came from British sources. So it's this, it's a huge question over the funding of the referendum campaign. It was the biggest funder of the referendum campaign, and we're now no longer certain if that was funded by British sources or sources from other countries.
You've also been looking at previously suspected but not proven links between the people you've just discussed, Cambridge Analytica and Steve Bannon, and, of course, just sort of tucked in at the end, the Russian ambassador to London, who I think these characters said they'd only met with once, and then you got hold of the emails that suggested or indeed demonstrated that not only had they met several times, but also various business deals involving diamond mines and gold had been proposed.
Yeah. It's a kind of an extraordinary story, and what's happened today, actually, about 15 minutes ago, Parliament just published the latest set of evidence which they've received. So it's from an academic called Emma Bryant, and he obtained these emails which were from Arron Banks to an employee at Cambridge Analytica And there CC'd in is Steve Bannon. And this is from back in 2015.
No. These people were adamant that foreign people, I mean, even elected presidents had no business interfering in British democracy. There's no way that they were shilly-shallying around behind the scenes with the bloke that ran Breitbart. And then there's
two amazing things about this. Here in black and white, written down in an email, is Arron Banks trying to seek help in raising money for Brexit from American sources. And that's with Steve Bannon's boss at the time was Robert Mercer, who's this hedge fund billionaire, who's the man who bankrolled Donald Trump. And there is this email setting out, we're looking to raise money in the US for Brexit. So that's evidence one. And then the other extraordinary thing about this same email, is that Arron Banks is talking about how they're going to have 3 presentations about Leave EU in London on November the 17th and the 18th. Now, we know one of those presentations was where they presented Nigel Farage's campaign to the British press. And with Cambridge Analytica, they were like, this is the plan, this is going to be our campaign, it's going to be the people's campaign. But yet, on the same day, we discovered earlier this summer, myself and another journalist, Peter Duke, we got hold of this other set of emails, and that showed that on that same day, November the 18th, Arron Banks was inside the Russian embassy, meeting the Russian ambassador, who introduced him to a Russian oligarch who offered him this series of gold and diamond deals. So it's just so phenomenal. I mean, what's kind of extraordinary is there you see this money from the US outright, you see potential money from Russia, and it's all coming together on a single day in November in 2015 when they stood up and said, this is the people's campaign.
Watch this space. Arron Banks, of course, always welcome to appear on this programme. Like Carole, I'm prepared to rise above petty insults. I believe he recently called me a coin-operated whore of a journalist, which is quite mild compared to some of the... Well, it's quite mild, Carole, compared to some of the stuff that's been levelled at you. And as you know, you will always have a platform on this programme for your award-winning journalism, even if other presenters are inexplicably less keen to share in your success and ride the coattails of your investigative brilliance. But speaking of other journalists, the Daily Mail, a slip of the tongue, the BBC doyen of political presenters, Mr. Impartiality himself, Andrew Neil, recently took to Twitter to abuse you in the roundest of terms. That must have been quite an experience.
Oh, it's the thing about it is it's very... What I'm trying to get over about this Andrew Neil thing, the personal abuse is one thing. He called me crazy cat lady, but it's not the fact that this is just personally nasty and offensive and misogynistic, although it is. What's the key thing about this, and which the BBC do not understand and are being blind to, is that he is directly echoing the language of Arron Banks. And Arron Banks is using this language, as he has for a year now, not just to be nasty to me, but to discredit my journalism, but also to distract from the actual story, which is the funding of the Leave campaign and his relationship both to Donald Trump, Steve Bannon and co., but also to the Russian government. And so for the BBC star presenter to collude in that, and then for the BBC to not see that there's a problem, to refuse to make any statement about it, to deny me a right to reply. This is the extraordinary thing. Arron Banks went on the Andrew Marr show, and he was asked a question about the front page story in The Observer, and Arron Banks called me a blackmailer and a thief. And the BBC wouldn't give me a right to reply about that, to explain why he's making those accusations. And he's making those accusations, which are so serious. He's reporting me to the police, and we have to take that very seriously in the Guardian Observer. These are real threats against not just me, but against and the journalism, but against the newspaper itself. And it's being propagated and amplified by the BBC. And I think I'm seen as being, this sort of troublesome individual who's sort of like flinging around accusations at the BBC, unmerited. But I'm really trying to just
I have a theory. Do you want to hear it? Because I've worked there. I've worked there a bit, as you know. I felt unable to continue to do so because I wanted to express strong opinions about Trump and Brexit. Not quite as strong as the opinions Andrew Neil expressed about you, but I guess it's one rule for the publisher of the Spectator and another rule for a lowly gob on a stick like me. But I don't think it crosses their mind because they've spent decades, and you know as much about this as I do, dining with these people, going to their parties, going to their Addison Club meetings, doing it doesn't actually cross their mind that the malfeasance could be on the sort of scale that you're alleging and increasingly reporting. It's almost at what Freddie Ayer would have called a category error. They can't quite. This sort of thing happens in banana republics. It couldn't possibly happen in Britain, and it couldn't possibly have involved hoodwinking senior BBC journalists into believing that this is just business as usual.
There's the scale of this, James. I feel so overwhelmed at the moment. There is so much. There are so many angles. There's so many threads. There's so many things which are not being reported on, and things which the government is refusing to say. And
that suggestion, undenied, that Theresa May turned down a suggestion that banks be investigated as long ago as 2016 by security services.
Exactly, and more than that, the government will not answer Parliament's questions about what. So Damien Collins, he's hardly a rabid rabble-rouser. He's a Conservative MP, deeply believes in the rule of law, and he's just asked the government to answer very basic questions about what it's doing. So what are the intelligence services doing with regards to this? What is the NCA doing? We still have had no confirmation about if they're investigating Banks' relationship with the Russian government. And so what? And the government is also refusing. So there's also news has just dropped, okay? 8 parliaments, this is extraordinary, 8 parliaments have now joined together for this international committee, which is happening in London next week, to demand answers from Facebook, to demand Mark Zuckerberg to come and answer questions about what happened on his platform during our elections and during these other, countries' elections. And he's refusing. And what's even more scandalous to my mind is the fact that the government is not backing Parliament's calls there. And it's because you see there's sort of there's aligned interests here. Facebook really doesn't want to get into this. It really doesn't want to admit that this, terrible things were happening on its platform through 2015-16, and nor does the government, because its legitimacy hangs upon this vote, this Brexit vote, which there are, I counted up 9 either serious or criminal investigations now into the Brexit vote. It was not free and fair. It was not a free and fair vote. And
leaving aside criminal, actually not leaving them aside, but there's another amazing piece of journalism undertaken by an organisation I hadn't come across before called DeSmog, D-E-S-M-O-G today, which tracks that Tufton Street connection, which we spoke to Shamir Sani. Shamir, of course, one of your first and crucial sources, but what we need to remember is that Downing Street currently employs people in prominent jobs who came from that nexus of 55 Tufton Street that essentially represents the fossil fuel lobbies and an American so-called libertarian business interests. So I'm not suggesting we should have sympathy for Theresa May, but if she did properly recognise the scale of what you're suggesting, she'd be left staring some of her closest allies in the eye and wondering what the hell they were doing in the heart of government.
And this is what's so interesting about this. This has been really well documented in the United States, particularly by a journalist called Jane Mayer of The New Yorker. And what the sort of dark money interests have done in the United States, people like the Koch brothers, they've created a whole network of fake think tanks and fake research bodies.
Sounds familiar.
And they feed into the public. They're
not called the Taxpayers Alliance by any chance, are they?
Well, what we've seen is an exact model which has been set up in Britain, and we see these links very clearly through from all of these, the Taxpayers Alliance and the IEA and the Adam Smith Institute, through to these same organisations in America. And this is Anglo-American. And so the thing that people are not waking up to here in Britain is our political reporting follows what is happening in Westminster. It's following every spit and cough of the Brexit negotiations. But it is not seeing that this is a far bigger picture, and in which Brexit is so entwined with Trump. We are so entwined. It's part of the same forces. And I absolutely respect people who voted Leave. You know, members of my family did.
Same here.
This is not about personal opinions. You know, we all have our own, but this is about, massive foreign interests who are staging what is kind of like a hostile corporate takeover of the UK.
Carole Cadwalladr, as I stressed earlier, you will always have a platform here for your award-winning journalist. Well, I'll see you at the British Journalism Awards, will I, next month?
I've kind of lost track.
Well, you're probably going to win another one, and I'll get another also-ran. But hey, there's no bitterness. There's no bitterness at this end of the phone line. Carole Cadwalladr of The Observer and The Guardian, the multi-award winner. Let's just run through them again, actually, given that somebody like Andrew Neil has the barefaced audacity to question her credibility. He hasn't apologised, by the way, just had that tweet deleted at 3 o'clock in the morning, I think he sent it. Remains a key presenter on the BBC, continues to publish a Spectator magazine on behalf of the Brexit-supporting billionaires, the Barclay brothers, who also, of course, own the Ritz Hotel. But remember, they're the anti-elites. She's the elite. It's 10 to 11.
Going to talk about something else you'll all be relieved to hear. And this is a story over the weekend in The Observer. Let's show our viewers the headline. Their emails reveal Arron Banks' links to Steve Bannon in quest for campaign cash. Arron Banks, obviously the millionaire donor and leader of the Leave.eu campaign. Now, the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee have published the emails this morning as part of evidence from Dr. Emma Bryant, an academic at Essex University. She says she was given the emails by a former employee at Cambridge Analytica. Let's have a look at one of them. We would like Cambridge Analytica to come up with a strategy for fundraising in the States and engaging companies and special interest groups. Also, how could we connect to people with family ties in the UK and raise money? And this was an email that was sent from Arron Banks to his right-hand man, Andy Wigmore, asking him to pass a message on to 3 people from Cambridge Analytica. Is this a serious story?
Well, I think, congratulations to The Observer and Carole Cadwalladr in particular in exposing this web of links between all these different organisations on the right. Look, it's not surprising that Steve Bannon is connected to the likes of Nigel Farage, and you see this report. It is part of a global network which is pushing a particular form of populist far-right politics.
Right, but Chris, you used to have some oversight, I think, of these matters when you were a minister. Overseas donations to political parties are illegal. But is there anything prohibiting foreign donations to fund political campaigning outside of election time?
So donations are still from foreign bodies illegal, regardless of whether that's within the electoral period or not. So in terms of you've got to be on the electoral register to make a political donation to...
But it wasn't a party. Leave.eu wasn't a party. It barely existed at that point. That's the distinction.
Right.
So
it was a campaign.
So there's nothing illegal about this.
Hang on.
We actually don't know whether...
Hang on, one at a time. I will come to you.
The Electoral Commission have obviously come up with their own separate concerns, have passed on their concerns to be investigated by the National Security Agency. There is additional material being published today, and it'll be interesting to see whether the National Security Agency take that on board. But I think we've got to wait until that process goes forward to see if there's any charges that need to be made. There is still that opportunity to say, actually, when it comes to looking at electoral law, it is pretty tight around looking at sort of foreign donations and the ability not to be able to make it. And that's why, you saw in that email saying, is there anyone in the UK who could have money? People can donate from a UK address. Companies that have a UK address can donate.
It will feel inappropriate to some people because money can be donated. It may not be used at that point, but it might be used further down the line. Isabel, would you support a Mueller-style investigation into this question of foreign money in the referendum?
I would support an investigation into the fundraising by the Remain side. I think that the
that's not the question I asked, to be fair. Just looking at this for today, I take your point, but looking at this, would you support that sort of Mueller-style investigation?
An investigation that was on both sides and gave equal attention to both sides. I don't think anyone would have anything to fear over.
But there's no evidence out there or no suggestion out there that the Remain campaign might have spent money illegally that came from abroad, for example.
Well, I think there's plenty of evidence that there was money brought in from foreign supporters, isn't there?
You're thinking there is an accusation that money that went to the Remain campaign was illegally...
I don't know about the time periods that we're talking about, but here you're clearly not talking about the specific time period of the short election campaign during which rules apply. So I don't have any fears over this. I don't think there's any great thing to hide here.
I mean, I think the point is that we don't know know. So what our Observer investigation has revealed is that there was communication between Arron Banks and Steve Bannon about the potential.
Big wows.
But we don't know
I
if
can
that.
hear a gigantic
We don't know if that money was raised. We don't know when it was spent. There are big questions that have been raised by the Electoral Commission about where Arron Banks' £8 million came from.
That's
he was
a
one of the
separate thing,
biggest.
though.
Well, not necessarily. We absolutely do not know that. This is why we absolutely
You say wows,
need an
wowzer.
investigation.
Why won't people be interested in that? And
just don't
you know, who
think-
is Steve Bannon?
I
then?
just don't think people are talking about this down the pub. They're talking about let's get the Brexit deal implemented, delivered. Let's get something that's settled.
It is of huge. It is of huge concern to people. If this election was, or this referendum rather, was not fought fairly, actually, there's polling that shows that people would care about that deeply. Now, we don't know the firm answers to some of this stuff yet, but we absolutely have to have answers. The US has got this independent investigation inquiry. We really need something like that here. Otherwise, it makes a joke of our democratic processes.
Well, it's the first time on the programme, Isabel, since the National Crime Agency launched an investigation into Arron Banks.
I'm certainly not here to defend Arron Banks.
No, but you wrote a book about Mr Banks' exploits in the referendum campaign. Have the police been in contact with you in terms of their inquiry? They haven't.
I'd be very happy to help in any way, but I'm not here to defend Arron Banks or anything to do with that investigation.
Right. I mean, I'm asking because you've said that you became privy to a great many secrets during your time working with Arron Banks. Were you aware of any wrongdoing or illegality?
In relation to what?
In relation to Arron Banks, in terms of sources of donation, in terms of the sorts of things that the National Crime Agency are looking at?
Well, nothing that would constitute any kind of criminal offence that I'm aware of, no.
Right. So when you say a privy to a great many secrets, it does rather tantalisingly question what it is you're talking about.
Well, absolutely, and I've put all of that in the public domain, and indeed more of that would have been in the public domain had the process not been interrupted by the Observer and its journalists.
All right. I mean, there may be a question for some people who feel, are you a journalist or a campaigner, or is there a line between the two?
I'm a Brexit commentator, but I will never step away from the chance to break a big story. And absolutely, if I found information that I thought was of national significance or national interest, I would be the first to make sure that that got out.